any more information, you can go to our website at biggroup.org.au. This webinar is being recorded, so if you like, you can always go back and listen to it tomorrow or the next day, or pass it on to people that you think might be interested. So as I said, tonight's topic is containment areas. On our farm, we developed a containment area about 15 years ago with a view to use it maybe once every 5 years in a drought situation. In the past 15 years since we've had it, we've used it almost every single year. So that's how important it is within our production system. And with the price of livestock and the value of our soils and pasture at the moment, they're really an important part of our system, but also it's really important to be able to get them right. So this webinar is supported by the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program. So thank you very much to them for helping us provide this webinar to you. Tonight's guest speaker is Hamish Dickson. He's a Principal Livestock Consultant for AgriPartner Consulting. He has over 15 years experience in the agricultural industry, working in roles both on and off farm. He has specialist knowledge of ruminant production systems and is regularly called on to assist with advice, training and research in sheep and cattle nutrition, management and financial analysis. So just before I hand over to Hamish to go through his presentation, I'll just hand back to Carlin because she's just going to ask you a few simple questions just before we kick off. So thank you, Carlin.
Thanks, Georgie. Just to familiarise Hamish with the audience out there tonight, on your screen we're just asking you a question about where you're listening in from tonight. So just click on your screen and that will provide us with some instant feedback. Okay, the results are that 37% of you are in the Barossa and surrounding areas, and the rest of the group's made up either with the Adelaide Hills or interstate. So just make sure this evening as you leave the webinar, we just after some additional feedback about where exactly you're phoning in from and how you heard about the webinar. Just some background for Hamish. If you'd like to tell us about what type of livestock production system you've got, either a sheep breeding or trading enterprise, a cattle breeding or trading enterprise, or a combination of those. This is a bit of an overview. Okay, so 40% out there have a sheep breeding enterprise and 35% cattle breeding. The remainder is a bit of a combination. And the final one, just to warm us up tonight, have you previously used containment areas on your farm? Within the last 2 years, more than 2 years ago, no, or you're not sure? Okay, thanks very much. That's great context for Hamish this evening. So majority of you have not used them before, but then there's a fair group out there who've used them quite recently within the last 2 years, and some a bit more outside of that. So I'm just going to pass over to Hamish's presentation. Over to you, Hamish.
Great, thanks, Carlin. That should be hopefully coming up on the screen now. Is that being seen?
All good.
Excellent, great. All right, look, welcome everybody, and I guess thanks for attending tonight and joining in to listen on really looking at stock containment areas and how we can use them, not only just in dry seasons, but what are some of the other opportunities that we can use them for. Like Georgie said, quite often I guess I've had the experience with clients that containment areas are put in with the idea of being able to manage those real drought years, but quite often they get a lot more use than that, and there's a lot of really handy benefits of actually having these facilities available on farm. So we're going to go through a bit today about talking through exactly what these containment areas are. I know some of us in those questions there said, well, we're not really sure whether we've used a containment area before. Some of it's just not applicable, and some of us haven't used them for a while. So we're just going to go through exactly what we're talking about and how they're different to other facilities like feedlots, for example, as well. We'll go through why we might actually look at putting these facilities in place as well. And we'll talk about how do we actually locate and design a containment area. And then finally, we'll touch on really managing them. And part of that is things like your induction and exit out of containment areas, but also looking at the nutrition side of things as well, and feeding, and not just meeting animal requirements as such, but how do we do it, and what are some of the efficient ways of doing that as well. So we're going to go through that information tonight. We've got obviously a little bit of time to go through that, and we've also got some time at the end for questions. So really, when we're talking about containment areas, you may well hear them referred to as drought lots or confinement areas as well. But effectively, all that we're talking about is a small area of the farm where we're bringing all of our stock into, or a good portion of our stock into, and they are fed all of their feed and water in that area. So effectively, we're not relying on paddock feed. So that's really all we're talking about. It's nothing too revolutionary. It's just a way of actually managing stock in a small area. And obviously, one of the really important aspects of this is we're trying to make sure that we're actually resting our paddocks and looking after the recovery of those. One of the big questions that often comes up is, well, is it different to a feedlot? And effectively, the difference is that in a containment area, we're generally dealing with stock that we're looking to maintain condition or just meet their requirements. Their design and their purpose isn't necessarily to drive production and growth. So in a feedlot sense, we're really looking at putting in, steers, heifers, lambs to try and maximize growth rates. In a containment area, we're looking to make sure that we maintain the condition of animals. And in a lot of senses, it's not just about, meeting the bare survival requirements of animals. We are absolutely trying to make sure that we meet requirements, including those that might be applied for pregnancy throughout the year as well. So it's not just about trying to meet survival in a real drought condition year. It may well be that we're using it at times at the break of the season that we have to meet just general maintenance requirements as well. So the question really is where do these types of facilities have a fit, and why do we look at them? And over the years, we drive around enough and you start to see images across the countryside that make us think there is a lot of opportunity for containment areas. And these sorts of images, which are more mallee based, really give us a clear indication as to why we need to conserve the ground cover out the paddocks. And one of the big drivers of this is obviously stock remaining out on paddock in seasons where they can't be sustained out there. And it's not just mallee or light soils that these sorts of situations occur. Certainly on heavier soils, when we have tough seasons and we're trying to hold stock in paddocks, then certainly we get to the situation where we start to degrade the paddocks that we've got available to us. And the biggest issue in this sort of situation is that obviously we are taking our pastures right down to the ground, and in that sort of situation, the big issue is that when we do get some rainfall, their regeneration rate is going to be far, far slower than what it was if we were able to leave some leaf area, some biomass there, even if it's just enough to maintain ground cover. One of the other situations that containment areas have come up over the last few years in a number of regions has been fires. This is a picture of the Pinery Fire area, and it's been no different with some of the others through the Barossa as well, that containment areas can often have a role in these sorts of disaster situations where we need to be fully feeding stock and doing it very quickly. And one of the most common times that we're often looking at trying to utilise containment areas as well is when we are coming through that autumn period and potentially we are waiting on feed growth to start to occur. One of the worst situations that we can put livestock under, especially if they're high demand, such as animals that are in late pregnancy or calving or lambing, is to have them running around on pastures which are very short with grain feed, because the nutritional quality of that feed for them is really very far off what their requirements are. The high moisture content can actually really limit intake as well as just the feed availability. So often using containment areas where you can actually hold stock off those pastures for a while until they actually get up to a level, to a feed on offer availability that stock are able to consume enough, can actually have very positive outcomes, not only for the stock, but also for those pastures and the production that you'll get that year. So one of the things that we need to be thinking of is, we've discussed, I guess, the dry time options. One of the other things that comes into play, particularly when we're looking at it as a longer term solution, is how containment area might play into your overall carrying capacity of the property. And one of the things that I find is often where we have a containment area fitted into the program, maybe not every year, but reasonably regularly, is that it can actually allow us to increase our overall carrying capacity. It allows us to actually really capture some of the rapid spring growth periods better, and allows us to carry those stock over in the seasons where we don't have as big a spring growth seasons. Now, it's very careful in each of those years to make sure that the costs associated with running containment areas are analysed, but when it's done properly, they can actually play out very well in terms of overall farm profitability. Obviously, the containment areas have big positives in terms of environmental protection, in terms of ensuring that we maintain good levels of ground cover. We reduce the amount of erosion across the property, not only just wind erosion, but water erosion. So these are positives not only from an environmental point of view, but also from our farm productivity point of view. The allowing winter feed to get away, we've talked about there, and sometimes we also have these facilities available to us to use as a feedlot in particular seasons as well. We're going to go through quite a bit in terms of the design of these systems. And one of the things is that quite often, really the design and the management principles around a containment area are not very dissimilar at all to a feedlot. So there's often options that you can use these facilities for multiple uses as well. One of the things that happens with a lot of properties when we have containment areas available to us is that we find that we use them a lot more than just at times when we're trying to contain stock off paddocks for feeding. Shearing time, they provide a really useful area where stock can be allocated to. They can just be parked in some of the pens, provided some hay or whatever feed that's available to keep them going, and you don't have to be scrambling trying to get stock out into paddocks immediately after shearing, for example. So there's lots of opportunities that these facilities can just provide some benefits in terms of the day-to-day management. We're going to go through plenty of detail tonight on really setting up these areas and what are some of the key principles, but it is important to note that there is information available online. So one of the resources one of the newer resources that's around is the Stock Containment Areas fact sheet by the Adelaide Mount Lofty Natural Resources Board. That's available online, and that has some good information in there around how to set up containment areas, what are the main guiding principles around the design and some of the management aspects of them as well. In some greater detail, again, there are national guidelines which MLA published a number of years ago now, which are for intensive sheep feeding systems. So they cover containment areas, but also feedlots. So that information is available online as well. And obviously there are a number of contacts that are available through the BIGG group, through industry advisors, and also don't forget that quite a number of you on this webinar had containment areas and had used them in the past. So there may well be local farmers that you can have a chat to about their setup and how they actually manage it throughout the year as well. So what we're going to go through is a little bit on the site selection side of things. How do we set these systems up? And these are the type of really key considerations that we need to look at. And things like our slope, how much area do we need, considerations for shade and shelter, proximity to yards and laneways, what sort of feeding and watering equipment are we going to use, and also some of the environmental and community amenity aspects around neighbours and waterways, and also being conscious of any industry or council guidelines that we need to be aware of as well. So one of the first things that we need to look at when we are selecting a site is being aware of slope. Okay, and slope is a really important aspect of using a containment area, in that we have to be able to allow for runoff to occur in a rainfall event. Now, hopefully, at some point when we're using these systems, we're using them because we've had a dry season and we're waiting for rainfall, and we're waiting for pasture growth. So we have to have an area which is capable of handling some moisture. And this is an example of one area that certainly has some great aspects in terms of feed and shelter, but this is what it turns into when we get the water that comes through. Okay, so this is far from ideal in terms of a containment area for stock. So we can't have areas that have got little or no slope on them. Now, there are some areas of the country which we don't have slope to work with. And in those sorts of situations, we have to be able to have a release area where stock can get out to if needs be. So slope is a really important aspect of managing containment areas. Even in conditions where we're dealing with, say, sandier soils, we need to be able to use some level of slope on this sort of country. And in this sort of situation, the primary concern then is actually hollowing out areas of that sandhill. So quite often in these situations, we end up looking at trying to put some level of rubble or lining that area. And that's what you're seeing in this particular image here. So they've actually clay lined and rubbled this actually area. And one of the things that you can see is that they've actually got that shade placed on a north-south axis, which is the correct direction for shade, so that we actually get it transitioning across the pen from side to side, and we're not getting any areas that are constantly covered in shade all the time. In terms of the pen, the slope percentage that we're looking for is between 2 and 6%. Ideal window is generally sort of 2, 3, maybe 4%. But at the upper end, we can sort of extend it out to 6% if really needs be. If you're not great at estimating slope by eye, these days there are actually some reasonably accurate phone apps available. So have a look at that if you're interested. There are some phone apps where you can actually start to just use your camera. It'll use your camera and you set out your lines of the horizon basically, and it can actually give you some estimates of what the slope is in percent. So that can be a handy tool just to get you started at least. One of the other really important parts of aligning pens is to make sure that they go across the slope. Often I've seen some containment areas or feedlots set up where the pens are from top to bottom down the hill. And obviously what happens in that situation is, unfortunately, the pens at the bottom tend to cop all the runoff. So it's not ideal. So try and make sure that you've got your pens aligned across the slope. One of the next questions is, how much area do we need, or how many stock can we run in a given amount of area? And these are the types of stocking densities that we're looking for. So from a containment area point of view, for sheep, for ewes, we're looking at around that 5 to 10 metres squared per head. For cattle, we're looking at, for young stock, 12, 14 metres squared per head. For cows, 15 to 25. Now these are really where we can sort of take these areas down to. To a degree, having slightly more area than these amounts is not a big issue. Certainly if, for the ewes, for example, we took it out to 15 metres squared per head, or even 20, it's not the end of the world by any stretch. One of the things that we do just want to avoid is that we're not giving them so much area that we're giving the opportunity for feed to grow. Because if we start to have that occurring, then what will happen is we'll start to lose control over the ration. And what tends to happen when we start having green pick in particular coming through is that those stock will chase that green pick constantly rather than necessarily consuming the ration that we've put together for them. So that tends to only happen when you have much greater areas available for stock. So that's one of the reasons why having containment areas and stocking them in relatively small areas is actually very effective in terms of being able to control the diet and making sure that we meet the animal requirements. One of the other aspects is making sure we have shade and shelter available to stock that are in containment areas. And one of the really important parts of this is making sure that, particularly where we're using natural shade, is that we have to have them fenced off. Sheep and cattle are both very effective at effectively killing off trees that are in containment areas over time. Certainly, they provide a nice bit of entertainment when they're in a containment area otherwise, and they will just ring bark all of the trees, and you'll find that over 2 or 3 years, most of them tend to drop off. The image there you can see on the left-hand side is actually quite an interesting image just to be aware of particularly where you have lighter soils. Be conscious of what's going to happen with the root structures in some of these trees as well. So certainly, ideally, those trees should have been fenced off in the first place. But the other aspect is that you'd have to be conscious of making sure you provide some coverage and protection to those roots as well that are becoming exposed. Because equally, if they start to take a lot of damage as well, then there's probably a risk that some of those trees would be lost as well. Artificial shade structures are certainly used quite commonly in containment areas. In some situations, these sorts of eco shelter or plastic dome shelters are used. They're reasonably cost effective. They're coming down a little bit in price these days, but more often than not, people tend to go with shade cloth structures. And they can be fairly simply put together. They can be as simple as an image like this one, where you just have a wooden post structure to put the shade cloth on. One of the really important aspects of shade cloth is to make sure that you secure it very well so that in any sort of wind event, they don't tend to just tear and you tend to lose the shade cloth. So if you secure it well and even use a cable system, then you'll tend to find that shade cloth will last a very long time. The other part with shade is also ensuring that we can provide some shelter to stock. So certainly in summertime, we're trying to give protection from heat stress. And as the colder months come in, if we're still waiting on feed and we're using some of these areas, then we do want to be conscious of providing shelter from a cold stress point of view. So that's predominantly around giving us some protection from wind. Certainly trees and hedgerows around the outside of the area work very effectively in slowing that wind speed down and providing some good shelter for stock. And certainly even things like using big square bales can work quite well as well. Ideally, they're not positioned like this where they're inside the pen. Okay, so they should be outside the pen, or otherwise all that happens is that eventually they get eaten out and they'll cave in, as these ones did about a week later. With these types of facilities, one of the things that's really important is that at induction time, there are going to be several operations that you're doing in terms of potentially splitting stock up into categories or weight ranges. There's some health treatments, things like your vaccinations that you'll be doing. And also it's going to be fairly useful to have these facilities close to handling yards so that you can bring them in and manage them if you need to. So there's no point putting a containment area a long way away from your handling yards, for example. So make sure that you've got them close to your yards, and also that you have a good laneway system to get them in there. You don't want to have to be taking a long amount of time to muster them in and out of your yards. You should ideally have a simple lane system where you can just even release stock out of the yards and they can make their own way into the pens in the perfect scenario. So make sure that they're close to those facilities, even relatively close to your residents to some degree. Now, you don't want to be too close that you're copping a whole lot of dust and all those sorts of issues coming through. But if you have them relatively close that you can drive by regularly and check on stock, then that's a positive thing as well. In terms of managing the feeding of stock in these facilities and then how you can actually feed them, there are a few different ways, and one of them is through the use of lick feeders. Now, lick feeders differ a little bit from what are termed self-feeders, in that lick feeders you can generally restrict intake reasonably well. They're not perfect, but you can usually set a targeted amount of consumption per head per day and get to a fairly close range with that. Now, lick feeders, there's a whole range of different brands that are available out there that both cater to sheep and cattle. And they are generally probably the preferred way of feeding stock in containment areas, because they allow you to more efficiently use your labour. Where you have lick feeders in a containment area, you can go out, and depending on how many feeders you have in a pen, you might be going out and filling up those feeders once every week or 10 days or so. So your labour use is actually is much lower than if you were going to be going out and having to feed every day or every couple of days if you were trailing feed, for example, which we'll touch on in a second. So lick feeders are a very good way of actually providing grain to stock, and they're generally preferred in a containment area situation to self feeders, which don't really give you much ability to control intake. Self feeders are much more suited to a feedlot situation where we're trying to allow stock ad lib access to grain. In a containment area situation, we generally have a restricted amount of grain that we want to provide to animals. And if we allow them to consume far more than that, then generally all that's going to happen is they're going to put on more condition than potentially is required, and it's going to cost us more than what we want them to. Feeders, obviously, some of the investment is in the feeders themselves, and the other aspect is how do you refill them? Okay, so there are a number of grain carts that are available on the market that may suit that requirement, but also think about what other equipment you may have on farm that would suit it. Quite often seed and super units are used. I've seen chaser bins used. I've seen a header used once. So there are a range of ways that you can refill these types of these feeders, and if you've got something that's available to you on farm straight away, don't hesitate to use that. Using troughing is probably the other reasonably common way of actually feeding stock in a containment area, and there's a range of troughing systems that are available, from fairly cheap and easy systems like using things like guttering or corrugated iron just bent up into a trough shape. There's some systems available here like the one on the left there where they use shade cloth with some K-rail on the front to provide the basically where the head comes through. And those systems can work quite well, particularly in dusty or sandy environments. Those systems work well because any dust and dirt can actually go through the shade cloth in that type of system. Concrete bunkers are used occasionally, but more so in a feedlot sense. The investment involved in that type of equipment for a containment area, which is used reasonably irregularly, is generally just too much. One of the other systems that is used in containment areas sometimes is communal troughing. And in this sort of system, instead of each pen having their own trough to access, there are a series of pens and then one feeding area with a big communal trough. That the way it works is that you've put out the grain allocation for a particular pen on that day, and then you open up the gates and let that pen out, let them eat, and then once they're finished, put them back in their pen, and then put the feed allocation out for the next pen, let them in, let them eat, and then return them to the pen. So that sort of system certainly helps keep things like your trough costs down, but I think more often than not, these types of systems are actually a very labour intensive way of feeding stock in containment areas. There are more and more, and particularly in feedlot senses, but occasionally now in more containment areas, automated feeding systems which virtually remove all of the feeding labour in these systems, where you can use either grain mixes or particularly where you have a total pelleted diet. They work very well in terms of being able to provide feed to stock. So these types of systems basically just keep a trough full, or particularly in containment, you'd be looking to try and keep things like your lick feeders full so that stock can access the grain whenever they need, and you're not there even having to fill them up. They just work on generally a centerless auger system, which pulls feed from a silo at one end of your pens and keeps the feeding system full. So it's important to think about how much access you give to stock, because one of the really important parts of feed access is that if you provide enough feed, you tend to keep issues such as shy feeders well out of the equation. So if you're looking at using feed troughing, really we're trying to target 8 centimetres and really 8 to 10 centimetres per head is where we want to be trying to provide trough lengths for sheep. If you're looking at using self-feeders or lick feeders, then generally we're trying to use one feeder per 100 to 150 sheep. Now, the range in that depends a little bit on how much you are providing. So if you happen to be providing a ration which is providing relatively high amounts of grain, say 600 grams a day or more, then you'd be trying to get that feeder allocation down to the lower end of the spectrum. Conversely, if you are only providing relatively small amounts of grain to stock while they're in containment, say 150 to 200, 250 grams a day, then you could quite comfortably probably push to 150 animals on a feeder in that sort of situation. One of the important aspects though is that we should always try and make sure we've got at least 2 feeders in a pen or for a mob. And part of the reason is that you will always have some level of dominance between animals in a pen. And if you have one feeder, you tend to have a group of animals that will stay on that feeder and really not allow some other animals to come to that feeder. So 2 feeders as a minimum is a very important aspect of managing stock and containments as well. Water trough. Look, the old recommendation has been around for a very long time for water troughs for sheep of 30 centimetres plus 1.5 centimetres per animal, and that's been around forever. The basis of that recommendation is really not very well understood. It's just been something that's been published forever and a day. Probably what's more important is actually pressure and ensuring that we always have access to water. For cattle, these are the equivalent recommendations when we're looking at things like trough length for feed troughs and obviously for self-feeders as well. And certainly with water troughing at the same point that we have recommendations around, how much is required per animal. But equally, I think pressure is a really important part of this, ensuring that when stock drink, it's refilled quickly and there is always access to water. One of the really important parts of managing nutrition in containment areas is that water intake to a large degree can drive feed intake. So if water intake is reduced through either lack of access or poor quality water, quite often what happens is feed intake is reduced, and then we find that we have issues with maintaining condition on stock. One of the other systems that is used occasionally in containment areas is doing a total mixed ration. So rather than providing grain through feeders on their own, we look at providing grain and roughage together as a total mixed ration. And typically to do that, we then require something like a feed mixer, like you'll see Keenan's or these other brands available on the market. If you were purposely buying this equipment to set up a containment area, it's likely to be a way far too expensive way to go in terms of setting these types of systems up. The only exception is that we need to be conscious of cattle, in that we need to process grain for them. And in some situations, if you have this equipment and you're processing grain through it, like rolling it, then it can be a valuable piece of equipment. But it's a large investment for a system which is used reasonably irregularly, and there are simple and very effective ways of managing containment areas that may not require it as well. Roughage is something we haven't touched on yet, and how we feed it, and certainly in containment areas and even to a degree feedlots, we have to make sure that we have roughage available to stock ad lib. We have to make sure that stock have roughage each day to ensure that we really manage rumen health and we manage the risk of acidosis when we're feeding grain at the same time. So in the marketplace, there are some products or recommendations around for grain only diets, and my view is that they're a very dangerous ration to go down the path of. And what tends to happen is that to make those rations work, it requires a whole lot of supplements to manage the acidosis risk, and those supplements just happen to be very expensive. So quite often there's actually far cheaper ways of going about it, and providing hay or straw roughage available to stock ad lib is not only cheaper but tends to manage the acidosis risk in a far better way as well. Water troughing is a really important part of containment areas, and we have to provide lots of ready access to water for stock. And certainly these traditional plastic troughs can work okay. One of the things that we want to try and make sure of is that we keep them clean and we regularly empty the water out of these and have fresh water available to stock all the time. More and more now, what we're finding is that people, particularly for sheep, less so for cattle, are looking at these sorts of PVC water trough types, where we're using bigger diameter PVC pipes with cutouts for access for stock. And these types of troughs are working very well, like I say, more so for sheep, but they work very well in terms of being able to keep fresh water available to stock all the time, and also minimise the amount of water that's wasted when we need to empty those troughs and clean them out. Ideally, one of the things that we do when we set up these water troughs is that we have them at the lower end of the pen, so that any wastewater is actually directed outside of the pen, and we're not creating big wet areas in the pen like you're seeing in that middle image there. Conversely, ideally, we have our feed, either our grain feeders or our feed troughing located at the high end of the pen as well, at the other end of the pen. And the reason for that is separating our water and our feed helps ensure that we have less contamination of our water with either grain and or hay. If we put them close together, what tends to happen is stock will go and eat some feed, and they will go directly over to the water trough and generally still have some feed in their mouth, have a drink, and then we end up with an accumulation of grain and hay in the water trough, which will eventually spoil if it's not cleaned regularly. So one of the things just to be also aware of is when we're locating containment areas that we are conscious of any sort of sensitive areas that are around. So we don't want to be putting a containment area right on a road or next to a watercourse, right on your property boundary, and also make sure that you've got distances, appropriate distances to things like neighbours and local towns as well. So standards vary a little bit, and particularly from state to state. So some of us as interstate listeners tonight, so check in with some of your local regulations as to what is an appropriate distance. Certainly from a containment area point of view, there is probably slightly less concern around having really big separation distances as they're used quite irregularly compared to something like a feedlot. Moving on to discussing some of the nutrition aspects of feeding stock and containment, we need to be conscious of that certainly when we look at nutrition in containment areas, often water can be forgotten, and it is actually one of the most important aspects of containment areas. We have to have really good quality water because that drives, like I said before, a lot of feed intake. And if water quality is poor, feed intake will be poor as well. So when you then move on to some of the feed intake or the feed nutritional aspects, one of the things we need to be conscious of is driving sufficient intake into these animals. And we need to be conscious of what the fibre intake or the fibre level of feed is, because that can dictate how much of a feed an animal can eat. We need to be conscious of what the protein content of feed is, particularly for stock that are in late pregnancy, because protein is a big driver of muscle growth. So high protein diets can really stimulate fetal growth. So that can actually be one of the causes of lambing or calving difficulties, is if we really put in too much protein into rations, then you can find that you can end up with lambing difficulties. Equally, if we find that we really restrict protein, then you can have very low birth weights in either calves or lambs as well. So we need to be conscious of how that plays out. Energy is a really important part of nutrition in terms of dictating condition score of stock. So managing condition score of stock, we have to make sure that we've got sufficient energy in the diet. NDF is neutral detergent fibre, and is one of the measures of fibre that we use for estimating how much of a particular feed an animal can eat if it's available in front of it ad lib. And vitamins and minerals are down the bottom there for quite good reason in that they are important in a containment area sense, and we need to manage them, but they are certainly not the priority. We have to make sure that we deal with things like energy and protein first. So we don't have time tonight to really go through the detail of ration formulation, but we do need to cover off that ration formulations will change very much depending on the live weight of stock, what their class is at that particular time. Are they just at maintenance? Are they in early pregnancy, late pregnancy? What's the maturity pattern of that particular type of animal? And things like what we're trying to do with condition score, their pregnancy score. All of those things you see in front of you are different aspects of nutrition, which mean that the ration formulation that you use will be slightly different, often from season to season. So it's not necessarily that we can always just have a set ration that we use year in, year out in containment area, because things like our feeds, the quality of the feeds that are available to us will change. And things like probably the condition score of the stock coming into containment might be different as well, and we might want to either improve the condition of those stock, therefore we'd be looking to bump up the energy intake. So we need to be conscious of the fact that rations will vary from year to year, and even vary throughout the period of containment at times as well. There are tables available that have the nutrient requirements of stock that cover off on things like dry matter intake, the energy requirements, their protein requirements, and they're available for both cattle and sheep. There's some information available from things like the More Beef from Pastures website, the Making More from Sheep website, which are both MLA products, and they detail a lot of this information that can help with ration formulation. One of the things that I do like to just go through is that there are a whole range of ways that we can formulate diets, and there are generally a range of ways that we can meet the requirements of an animal. What it comes down to at the end of the day is what suits the system that you have and how it suits your potential, I guess, methods of feeding. So one of the things to be conscious of in containment areas and even to a degree when we're looking at feedlots is that we need to be able to, I guess, drive feed intake of the particular ingredients that we want. And quite often what happens when we are using roughage available ad lib in the pen, which is a very important aspect in terms of managing rumen health and managing acidosis, we need to actually make sure that we have the intake of that roughage accurately assessed. And one of the things that also happens when we have, say, something like a very high quality hay available to stock in the pen is that you will often have a proportion of animals that even if we have grain available right next door to it, they may not go onto that grain. So the quality of the roughage can be very important in terms of dictating how animals will consume different parts of the ration. So one of the things to be conscious of is that sometimes in containment systems, very high quality hays, whether it's good quality cereal hays or even good quality legume hays, may not necessarily be exactly what we want. If a hay is sufficient quality to meet the requirements of an animal on its own, then sometimes they can have a good role in terms of meeting the requirements of those stock and have a fit in the containment area. But sometimes if we have a high quality hay, then and there's also a requirement to provide some grain to meet the requirements of those animals, then what tends to happen is we have a portion of animals, sometimes 20 to 30% of animals, that will sit on that hay and not want to eat grain. And what you find is that they then gradually slip back a little bit in condition. So in that sort of situation, often it's a little bit better to actually utilise something like a lower quality hay or even a straw, which stock will still consume and still meet their roughage requirements, but will actually stimulate them to also consume grain at the same time. So there's some little tricks like that you need to be aware of when we are looking at ration formulations and what suits different feeding systems as well. Obviously, if you're doing a total mixed ration, you have far more control over all of these issues, and you can basically formulate whatever you like. But the flip side to that is to achieve that, you have to go down the troughing system with a full mixer wagon as well. So we'll just sort of start wrapping up a little bit here, but really when we look at managing stock in these systems, we have to think about how we're going to bring them in, and induction is a very important part of managing stock and containment. And part of how you induct stock is a little bit down to what you're confident in managing. Some people are very confident in managing the increase in grain, so we need to be gradually increasing availability of grain to stock, or otherwise we run the risk of causing issues with acidosis. So certainly we need to do it very carefully. Some people are very confident in terms of being able to do that through lick feeders. Some people are very confident in being able to do that through trail feeding. So some of this decision making is up to what you're comfortable using as well. It's very important to make sure that we draft stock into appropriate categories, and that may be on things like their pregnancy status, it may be on their weight or condition score, because all of those things drive the ration formulation, and it also drives us, or drives our ability to meet the requirements of those animals in a very more cost-effective way. So vaccinations are critical coming into containment. So pulpy kidney is one of the big killers in a containment area. So stock have to receive a pulpy kidney vaccine prior to coming into containment. One of the other aspects is that as we're bringing stock onto grain, this is one situation where good quality hay is worthwhile. It can help provide, it can help drive fibre intake, and it can help manage that transition onto grain quite well. Grain rations like oats and lupins can be a very good grain to be using in these sorts of situations, because they tend to have a much lower acidosis risk than grains like barley or even peas on the legume front. And the other aspect is we need to be conscious of how we can manage the feeding in these sorts of situations, because if we have an ad-lib feeding situation where we have self-feeders for that grain, then we have to make sure we get stock onto grain well before they come into that containment area, because we know that we can't restrict it very well once they do come into the containment area. The other really important aspect of managing containment areas is exit. And we have to make sure that when we take stock out of containment, that we don't fall into any traps around having health issues with stock just as much as when they come in. Stock coming out of containment are generally going to undergo a fairly big change in diet. So normally they're coming out of containment because we've had feed growth, we've got fresh feed available out in the paddock. So that's a fairly significant change in the diet, and their rumen needs to adapt to that change. So we need to try and make that that transition as gradual as possible. And some of the little things that you can do to try and help with that is to make sure that we've had stock on good quality hay for at least a few days before they exit, and that just helps ensure that the rumen is full of generally some good quality fibre, which is going to be slower to pass through. Make sure that you put them out late in the day, so don't take them out of containment first thing in the morning when they're about to go out and have a big graze. Put them out late in the day. And also be conscious of where they're up to with things like their pulpy kidney vaccination. So once again, a sudden change in diet coming out of containment and onto fresh green growth can be another situation which is high pressure for pulpy kidney. So if they haven't had their vaccination for a few months, then it may well be worth topping them up again with another vaccination at that point. Managing things like grazing cereals and calcium deficient pastures can be one of the tricks in terms of exiting containment and making sure that things like hypocalcemia don't hit stock as they come out. And also just consider stage of pregnancy and time of lambing or calving, and having enough time to that point that they're not going out at the point of lambing or calving as well, and that's managed well. Georgie or Carlin, I think we'll probably wrap it up there, and happy to take some questions if you like.
Thanks, Hamish. If anyone's got any questions, simply raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask it direct to Hamish, or type away in the question box and I'll read it out to Hamish. So, any questions? Clearly a very thorough presentation, Hamish. Did you have any questions for Hamish, Georgie?
I did have one, Hamish. What would, like our pastures at the moment, they're dropping in quality, but there's still a lot of bulk. What would be a good benchmark for our pastures to say, right now my stock need to go into containment?
One of the other aspects to think about in terms of using containment is when you use it in relation to stage of pregnancy as well. So pasture condition is one, and I'll touch on that in a second, but the other thing I guess I haven't spoken about is, because we are fully feeding stock, one of the things we want to be conscious of is how we keep that cost to a minimum. So if we are using containment for the example of containing stock leading up through the autumn and waiting for our break and getting pastures going away again, if we have stock that are in late pregnancy during that time, then ideally what we might do is actually look to contain them far earlier and conserve paddock feed for that time, because that's always going to be a cheaper feed resource. The quality certainly won't be any good at that point still, because it's still just dry carryover feed presumably, but it's still a cheaper feed resource to use, and you can supplement to make that quality up. So part of that decision-making process is, should I be actually containing stock sooner, because it may well cost me less to feed an animal which is in early pregnancy than late pregnancy, and when they are out of containment, yes, I'm probably still going to be potentially providing some supplementation in the paddock, but it's more than likely a cheaper way to go. In terms of the paddock side of things for benchmarks on that point of view, certainly we want to make sure that we're conserving enough feed available in the paddock that when we do get some rainfall for that to generate and grow away again, that there's enough there for that to occur. So generally we're looking at trying to maintain at least a tonne of feed. Now that will vary a little bit depending on soil types and the type of feed that you're dealing with, but realistically, if you can conserve 900,000 kilos of feed in the paddock, then that's the bottom end of where you want to go to. So that gives you a bit of a guide. Does that kind of help?
Yep, brilliant. Were there any more questions, Carlin? I've got another one if...
Yep, I can see there's a few coming in now.
Okay.
I'm just going to unmute Sandy. He didn't quite work. Hold on. No, I'll just read out this other question while I organise Sandy's microphone so we can hear that question. So this other question is, what about BRD vaccinations for cattle in addition to pulpy kidney vaccination?
Yeah, look, it's something to which is probably gaining a little bit of interest. So certainly in containment areas, but more so in feedlots. Respiratory disease is a big issue in feedlots, and BRD vaccinations are virtually stock standard now in most feedlots. In containment areas, we don't tend to have the same level of problem, partly because stock aren't under the same levels of stress. Generally, we're not in a situation where there's as much dust to be dealt with. We are probably at the time of the year, generally around autumn is a time of year when a lot of those respiratory diseases are at their worst, but I tend to see that there's often not big problems with respiratory disease. So something like the BRD vaccinations aren't particularly cheap. So I would normally say, unless you are experiencing issues with it already, it's something that you can probably do away with. And if you are having issues, then potentially I'd be looking at some of those causes first to see whether they can be addressed as well. If not, then certainly it's an effective product. Okay,
Sandy, would you like to ask your question? I've unmuted you.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. It's great bit of information there. Also, would you advise to use coarse salt in each pen to settle the enzymes in the gut if they're feeling a bit off?
Coarse salt?
Yeah, coarse salt that you get from the feed.
Yeah. So often when stock are coming in, part of it is just adjusting to that feed. Salt has fairly limited value in smoothing that transition very quickly. A lot of it comes down to really being able to manage the feed intake and being able to manage how much of those particular different feeds, so typically grains, they can actually consume. The biggest changes that we see, or the biggest issues that we see when we are transitioning that diet is normally variation in intake of individuals in the group, and that's why one of the most important aspects is making sure that stock have as much access to that feed as possible. So you don't, if you're trail feeding, for example, while you're getting stock onto grain, that you create a nice big long trail that all the stock can access at one point. If you limit access, then you will instantly start to create issues in terms of the individuals feeding in there, and you'll instantly tend to produce a bit of a tail in the group. Minerals in terms of using containment areas, particularly when we've got a cereal dominant diet, minerals like your calcium is really important. Salt's certainly important. It's not something you'd exclude out of the ration by any means, because it is still very important in terms of driving water intake, and that's an important aspect in terms of not only driving feed intake, but especially if you are containing male stock, then it's important in terms of looking after any issues with stones as well. So minerals are an important part of it, and one of the other things is just to consider really the class of animal. So if you have stock that are in, say, late pregnancy or even mid-pregnancy where they're under high demand, then you might even consider putting in some of the other minerals into the mix. So things like your magnesium, and some of the trace minerals as well, particularly if you know that some of your feeds have been produced on farm and may have some deficiencies depending on where you are.
Right, thank you very much.
Okay,
some of the buffers.
The next question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so that's right. I mean, some of the other things, I guess, that come into that transition, particularly coming onto grain, are less so things like salt, but more so your buffers. So things like acid buff, and to a lesser degree, things like sodium bicarb, and yeah. So, but some of the buffers can certainly have a good role in terms of providing some level of protection against acidosis.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
Got any others, Carlin?
Sorry, Hamish. Carlin's just having a few technical issues. Our next question is, you touched on rolling grain. Could you expand on that, please, and reasons for doing it and how?
Yep, sure. So I guess one of the key differences between sheep and cattle is that for sheep, we don't need to process grains in any way, shape or form. There's no benefit to it for sheep. Cattle, on the other hand, to efficiently utilise that grain, for the cattle to efficiently utilise that grain, we do need to break it down, to process it in some way. And typically that opens up options like rolling it, cracking it, hammer milling it. In feedlots, they'll go to the extent of things like steam flaking it. And basically that just helps to process that grain to a degree and expose really the starch inside. That allows cattle to more efficiently use the grain. And what happens if we don't is that we just waste a component of it. So depending on the particular grain and the quality of the grain, we can lose anywhere from sort of 15 to 35%, especially if we're using things like some of the feed grains or screenings especially. Then if we don't process that grain, then we will lose a fair percentage of it. Now, in some situations where the cost of that grain is quite cheap, sometimes if you can get it really cheap, it just offsets the cost of what's being wasted, and in some situations we just still use it. But ideally you do process the grain for cattle for them to utilize it well. So in terms of rolling, there's basically grain rollers that are available that either are a piece of equipment on their own. They're just two basically big steel drum rollers that squish the grain and help process it to start with. Sometimes they are incorporated into some of those feed wagons as well, or some of the other options are things like hammer milling. But yeah, probably your preference is generally rolling. Hammer milling, there's a lot of dust associated with that whole method, and it tends to be a not very nice job. So that's really the long and the short of it for cattle.
Sorry, Hamish, it's Carlin back again. My audio dropped out. We've got 3 more questions here. Someone's asking a question about ad lib feeders. Can you simply put mesh in a trough to make it a lick feeder?
No. Putting mesh in the bottom of the trough will slow intake rate to a degree, but it won't mean that you can seriously limit intake. Stock, if they want to, will just sit there for longer and consume generally more than what you're trying to do. So no, generally to really limit stock with a self-feeder, you have to have some sort of, normally the slide mechanisms, which will be more of a physical barrier to them really accessing that grain. And certainly, particularly with some of the sheep feeders, it tends to work a little bit on saliva on the tongue as well, and that drying up, which can limit intake. You'll still get a little bit of variation between individuals and how much they want to access those feeders, but yeah, certainly putting mesh in the bottom, we find will help stop those animals that just bulldoze along the trough and get a full mouthful at a time, but they can still stay there and access quite a lot if they want to.
Okay, any tips, Hamish, for vehicle access to stock areas?
Ideally, you want to have virtually no requirement for vehicles to go in the pens if possible. So generally, you can't get away with not putting out hay or straw in the pen, so that's normally in there. Some people will try and throw bales over the fences with telehandlers or whatever else, but inevitably someone's underneath at some point. But certainly with grain feeders, you can position them on your fence line, and that works quite well, especially if you've got a feed out cart which has a long enough auger or feed out mechanism that you can reach over the fence and into the feeder. So that can work quite well. So you have basically your feed, your lick feeders or self feeders on the top fence line, and then you can drive along outside the pen and basically fill from outside. So that's certainly preferable because, yeah, look, ideally you want to limit as much vehicle intrusion into the pens as you possibly can.
Okay, the last question tonight is, do you have any comments on weaning calves early, approximately 90 days into a containment area, in particular training calves to use lick feeders?
Probably the first comment is to make sure that if you're considering weaning calves early, that you also carefully consider the cost associated with keeping the calves on and feeding the cow. It may still stack up. So weaning calves early comes at a fairly high ration cost. So you need to do the numbers on the ration cost and the ration comparisons of those two. So provided that stacks up that you're still going to wean early, then one of the things to be conscious of is certainly having animals that are used to the equipment, so used to the feeders. So you can, if you're available, then you can actually try and use those feeders in the paddock prior to weaning so that they're familiar with them. And also that will then get them familiar with the feed at the same time, so that then when they do come into that sort of situation, into containment, they don't have a period there where they're trying to get used to the feeders. They're trying to get used to whatever feed that you're using in there. So that's certainly a couple of steps that are worthwhile to try and minimise any transitions there. Depending on where you are and what you have access to, things like silage might come into play in that sort of situation as well, or even the use of pellets at the same time. That's probably one thing we haven't talked about too much is some of the complete feed pellets can have a role, particularly with cattle, because they are a fairly easy way of feeding stock, because you obviously don't have to worry about doing all the grain processing and those aspects as well. With a complete pellet for cattle, you can basically just top your feeders up and let them go. So that may come in as an option for you too.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. That was all the questions I've got here, unless anyone else wants to put their hand up. Do you have any concluding comments you'd like to make, Hamish?
Yeah, look, there's probably just a couple of points on the screen that I think what are you saying? No, that's all right. I'll just talk through them. That's fine. They were probably up just before you took them off. But one of the things, I guess, just in terms of successful containment feeding is to be really proactive in how you manage it. And it is important to sorry, I'll just change this screen for you. It is important to try and make decisions early when you're looking at using a containment area, because if you find that you have let conditions slip in stock and then you try and bring them in containment and you're trying to feed them to get that condition back on, it tends to be a very expensive exercise. You are far better off if you can have stock in good condition, and if you are projecting forward through your feed budgets or what other tools that you're using, then you can see that there's going to be potentially a requirement to contain stock. Then while they've got the condition on there, it's far easier to maintain it. So get in early before any of that condition is lost, and it'll be a far cheaper exercise as well. And certainly probably the other aspect is part of that decision-making process is where containment areas fit in terms of looking at alternatives such as seeking agistment or culling stock, but certainly probably the last 1 to 2 years with the way the livestock prices are, and particularly also at times with the way that feed prices have been, containment areas have been a very, very attractive proposition rather than necessarily looking at always selling off stock. So some of those decision-making processes are also part of the mix as well. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. As everyone leaves this evening, if you'd like to complete the evaluation survey just to provide some data back through to Georgie and the big group. But thank you very much for your time tonight. And if Georgie's got anything further to add, that'll be all for this evening.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you both to Carlin and Hamish for providing all of the facilitation and the presentation. Brilliant information, and certainly food for thought about how we can look at putting containment lots into our own properties. If anyone wants any further information, I will send out an email tomorrow with a link to the webinar, also contact details for Hamish and for the big group. So please look out for that email. If you want any further information, please feel free to contact all of us. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, and yeah, look out for that email. Thank you.